Whenever someone asks me to recommend a good overall history of California, I don't hesitate to recommend the book California, A History by Kevin Starr. Why is this book so good, in my opinion? Because apart from being easy to read, engaging, and fairly short for somebody who wants an introduction to California's history, it's the author who was behind it. Kevin Starr was a unique individual with a real comprehensive vision of California. I had the pleasure of meeting him many years back, and since then, I was captivated by his way of looking at the state and just his overall background and perception about California's place in the world. So I was really fortunate recently to have a conversation with Jason Sexton. Jason edited a new volume about Kevin Starr and his work titled Redemptive Dreams, Engaging Kevin Starr's California. It's a fascinating collection of essays, and it's a great introduction to Kevin Starr's works, because Kevin Starr not only wrote that one book that I was talking about, but he wrote several volumes on the history of California. He was a newspaper columnist. He was a prolific author, even wrote fiction, just an amazing character. And so in this interview, we talk about Kevin's life and his work. And in fact, Jason called Kevin the most ambitious interpreter of the state that we ever had. And I agree. And Jason is a member of UCLA's California Center for Sustainable Communities, which is part of the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. And he teaches at UCLA's Department of Sociology. So as a UCLA graduate myself, always happy to talk to somebody affiliated with UCLA. Jason, in fact, is originally from Tracy, California, in the Central Valley, and he has a PhD in religious studies from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, in the UK. Now, our conversation is pretty wide-ranging, and this podcast is normally devoted to California history, especially the early history of California. But here we're going to talk about a lot of things connected to California and its history, and especially since Kevin Starr was a person who was involved in a lot of things. We are going to talk about Kevin's background from growing up in an orphanage to becoming California's most influential historian, and Jason's background. Jason, who grew up in the Central Valley, and how did he wind up at St. Andrews and in academia. And also, I think you're going to want to hear about why Jason, who really works in theology, is writing about history, and why he thinks theology and religion influenced Kevin Starr's own work. And this is part one of a longer conversation, and part two will be coming soon. So look for that as well. I'm Damian Bassage. Welcome to California Frontier. Jason, great to meet you and great to talk to you. I've been looking forward to this. Just as a little bit of background, I met Kevin Starr in 2008, I think it was. He did a talk about Jack Kerouac and his sort of religious journey, if you will. And I moderated that. And Dana Gioia he kind of gave a preamble introduction. And so that was my personal introduction to Kevin Starr, though I've recommended a lot of people to read his short history of California. But reading your volume, Redemptive Dreams, really taught me a lot more about this fascinating person who was Kevin Starr. And so when I read it, I said, I've got to talk to Jason. I've got to learn more. And so I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing your knowledge with us.
Well, it's great. Thanks so much, Damien, for having me. I love what you're doing with the California Frontier Project. And that story about Kerouac, I think it's in the single, is that in the single volume? I think it is, where he yes, certainly recovers Kevin as this, at least in literarily, and you mentioned Dana, this all makes sense now. Sort of the opening framing of Jack Kerouac, who in some ways is part of the canon of California literature. Kerouac on the Road, not on the Road. Why am I blanking on the name of the?
Which one, Big Sur? Are you thinking of Big Sur?
No, I'm thinking of the Westward Travel one. It's the book
on the road, yeah.
Oh, it is On the Road. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is the one of the few books in the California canon that mentions my hometown, Tracy. And Kevin also mentions Tracy. And this is a funny story I have about Kevin Starr when we did a book called Theology in California, which in many ways Kevin inspired because he kind of came to meet with us in 2013 and at the Berkeley City Club and gave a talk. We got together historians, sociologists, and theologians to ask the question: is there a theology of California? And Kevin, I was living in the UK at the time, and I called him on the phone, and he said, we had like a 45-minute conversation. He agreed to come for nothing, no fee. He just said, "I'll come, bring my wife." And I asked him specifically, the task was to talk about California identity and theology. So he came. We had these papers that people were giving, that came out in this book, Theology in California. And Kevin actually helped us launch it, I guess a year later, at Green Apple Books. And there's like 8 people that showed up. It was during California Lit Fest, so many events all over the city, and Kevin agreed to come, and it was such a big deal that, oh my gosh, Kevin Starr is coming to help us launch this. 8 people and a dog, so it was 9. And I think that might have included my co-editor, Fred Sanders, and Kevin. But Kevin came, climbed the stairs where they have this venue, and you're sitting around philosophy, and I asked Kevin, I said, you called my hometown. We could be really candid because there was only 8 of us. I said, you called my hometown the dusty town of Tracy in one of the volumes. And he looks over and he sort of touches me on the arm and says, I'm very sorry about that. And then he says, it's actually in a flood zone. Which is a story I love because it shows how Kevin is, he understands the particularities, both, historically. And I mentioned this because Jack Kerouac, right? He writes about the surly breakfasts that the rail workers are eating when he leaves the Bay Area and he's headed down to Southern California through the Central Valley.
So tell us, excuse me, why don't you describe a little bit who Kevin Starr was, his importance to California, and maybe what drove you to edit a whole volume about Kevin Starr?
Well, Kevin is, Kevin, having left us an 8-volume history of California, is what we say in the book, the most ambitious interpreter of the state that we've ever had. Because he's trying to tell the internal drama. I'm a 4th-generation Californian, and a lot of, I think, and I grew up in the Central Valley. I became a theologian, and of course now teach in a public university as a cultural historian. I teach in a sociology department. But when I finished my PhD, which is on sort of methodology, theological methodology, and I knew I was coming back to California and wanted to understand this place. And so I realized I needed to come into California literature. There was going to be a whole new kind of retraining I was going to have to do to try to understand California. And I figured that would be through historians, their understanding of the place, and through sociologists' understanding of the place. But I really couldn't get very far without bumping up into Kevin Starr. And that was such a gift, really. I think I read the first book that I read was Coast of Dreams, where he talks about my growing up era in California through the 90s, and the chapter on the homeboys and the prisons. And I found him really, with this encyclopedic grasp of things. I mean, he was reading newspapers, right? He was trying to understand how people were understanding the place who were on the ground, and so he does get, I think, some critique for his methodology. He's using narrative style. He's dependent, heavily on journalists, and he was one, right? He was one in the 70s into the early 80s. I think 76 to 83. Don't hold me on that. Peter Richardson knows, and we cover that in our chapter, right? Peter's chapter on his examiner years, which was a really very politically conservative Kevin Starr. So Kevin Starr, was multiple generations San Franciscan. He grew up really in tragedy. He grew up, father leaves the home. Mother has what used to be called nervous breakdown, is in an asylum, effectively, during the eugenic era. So, I mean, I don't know if we know what happened. And Kevin and his brother, I believe, were raised in an orphanage north of San Francisco, and he grew up then in the Potrero housing projects after that 5-year spell in an orphanage. Went to, I think, a year or two behind Jerry Brown at St. Ignatius High School, but found himself dependent on resources, right? Not just the housing projects, but then got a scholarship to go to University of San Francisco. Then was editor of the paper, and he was a gifted writer. He had military service, and then did a PhD in American literature at Harvard. And so after the time at Harvard, and that's where he says that he really discovered California, right? So he's in the library at Harvard reading figures like Josiah Royce, and now trying to understand where his life had come from. Right, what had made it what it was. And so obviously understanding the Catholic experience, cared for by nuns. And this is also towards the end of Kevin's life. Of course, he died in 2017. Would have loved to have had another 10 years with Kevin. In the last 5-6 years, his depth of grasp of the internal logics of California, critical, I think. But also hopeful in threads that he would often pick up for what he would call discovering a usable past. But he left us this massive contribution. Peter Richardson called it on a recent panel at the American Historical Association a monument. But I really think Kevin's work, the monument, think we may want to take some monuments down these days in this country, odes to, racist legacies and, settler colonial logics that have been harmed, that have destroyed cultures. But, and in that sense, I'm not that happy with calling Kevin's work a monument. Maybe it is. But I think really he left us a mountain of work that now is in the state archives. He left, when he died, 144 banker boxes to the California State Archive, the Sutro Library. And those have all been cataloged, I understand, just a couple weeks ago. But after that, because Kevin, not only was a Californian, he taught at USC for the majority of his career, but he was also for 10 years state librarian in the 80s and in the 90s. And as state librarian, he left, upon his retirement, 400 boxes of material that have yet to be cataloged. So Kevin left us a mountain of who he was, who he engaged. Of course, he was an early speechwriter for people like Dianne Feinstein. And he was just engaged. When he came back after the PhD from Harvard, he was writing speeches. He was writing columns. He was trying to get a job. Couldn't get, this is some inside conversation that historians and friends know, is for several years could not get a job. So he worked in the Alioto administration in the city of San Francisco, and then was city librarian of San Francisco, but he wanted to be in academia. And so my vague understanding is that he was constantly on the job market trying to figure out where to be. He had a supervisor run in San Francisco, freelancer, had a communications business, and then he finally got a job at University of Southern California, while always living in San Francisco, right? So he would sort of schlep down, and even when he was in Sacramento, and that's, you see in some of the front of his books, he would say Kevin Starr and put his location. He would say San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Sacramento. Well, he did live in these three places and never drove a car.
Yeah, I think that's one of the, that's amazing. I think that's one of the interesting things about him was he straddled north and south, right? Consummate San Franciscan. But then he was teaching at USC. He was flying back and forth. And he had this great appreciation for both, if you want to say, both ends of the state, and of course the Central Valley as well. So I think that's also something that really makes him stand out. And on a side note, you mentioned St. Ignatius High School. Funny, I was with my father last week, and sure enough, he told me, he went to SI in the 50s, and he knew Kevin Starr, and he knew Jerry Brown, and that class was full of, and also Gavin Newsom's father. That class was full of, people who eventually went on to make a big impact on the state. So it's an interesting connection there. So what about you? You mentioned you did your doctoral work in the UK, and you're originally from Tracy. You want to talk a little bit about that? I always love learning about the backgrounds of people who do these interesting things. I mean, coming into academia as somebody who grew up in Tracy, there are a few of us who shout out to my childhood neighbor, grew up across the street, who's a leading Black theologian, teaches at McCormick Seminary in Chicago, but taking a post at St. Louis University come this next academic year, and a legal scholar at Georgetown, Catherine. So several of us came from Tracy, and this was an era. Tracy's a prison town with a defense depot. Growing up in I was born in Santa Clara, and my dad was working class. Mom worked in a bank as a teller, and they moved to Tracy because it was sort of what developers, I think, were pitching as the last gasp of suburbia, And Kevin mentioned, it is part of the Bay Area now. That's a debatable point. As far as we can maintain it, I would really like to labor to see the integrity of places and their particularities. And this is a complicated place. You might say today that it's Trump land. But it was a place that I grew up, and a place where I joined a gang, a place where I got in trouble. So in the 90s, was expelled from school several times, and a place where from which I launched kind of a life throughout the state with a 3-year prison sentence in the California Youth Authority in the 90s. And so I was looking for how Kevin charted this too, right? And I've already mentioned that he I thought did a very good job of that. In fact, the first time I talked to Kevin, I shared this with him on the phone. And he wanted to know, didn't want to know what I did. A cocktail of, sort of charges, battery and drugs, sales and things like that. And there were 10,000 kids that were locked up in the Youth Authority in the 90s. So that was a moment where even Mike Davis said, "Has nobody written that history yet?" And I hope somebody will. Mm-hmm. Miroslava Chavez Garcia has gotten into a little bit, but so that's where I grew up, and then found myself on the green bus throughout the state, northern and southern. Did a year and a half in Stockton and a year and a half in Ventura, and kind of got to know the place like that. But Kevin had asked me,
after telling him this story, he said, well, you managed to get your record expunged. And I don't think he really cared about the politics of it all or any kind of stigma involved, even though it was still, this is right as Michelle Alexander's book had been published. So there was still a conversation waiting to be had, about prison reform. This is before Brown versus Plata, a Supreme Court ruling that precipitated realignment. But Kevin wanted to know, have you got your record expunged? And I think he really cared to see that Californians like me were making it, were, living the dream and sort of, incrementally taking steps that do matter structurally. Can you get your record expunged? Can you move forward in ways that, aren't hindered by entrapments that maybe we've created. And, I'm bothered, frankly, by one that looks like we've just created now with Proposition 1. And, where data isn't even bearing out that we need to have these sort of strong centralized state solutions to the homeless situation, because cities and local communities are making, some good efforts. And so what are we creating? California is the place that creates things, sometimes wonderful and sometimes harmful. And I think Kevin was right there. And so this is why, in my story, connecting with Kevin's, not only his 8 volumes, but then in our bibliography in the book, just this massive account of him writing on the daily. And he would tell his colleagues, you must write daily because your writing will outlive us. And of course it does. And Kevin, continued. And I find myself, looking to him as a source of inspiration, not in an uncomplicated way. We're critical in the book of Kevin at different times. And I think he invited that. In fact, he was supposed to respond to this volume. Of course, we lost him. So we had to do the project on our own.
Wow. That's really, and it's interesting how your life, intersects with his, parallels it in some ways. I'm sorry to belabor this, but then how did you wind up in academia?
Well, and that's, it's funny because when I was paroled from the Youth Authority, there was not the kind of helps that we have now. So I went to a small liberal arts college to study theology. I couldn't leave the state because I was on parole.
Now, why did you want to study theology?
Well, I'd come into it as I grew up actually Mormon in Tracy, and but sort of found my journey parsing that out away from the particular kinds of religious backgrounds that I've had, not just Mormon, but was initially baptized Methodist, and so but I grew up with Sikhs, and I was often going with friends to Catholic masses, and so there's such a rich array of religious representation, of course, in California, on the Pacific, with Vietnamese friends who sometimes were Catholic, sometimes Buddhist. So I grew up in a lot of this, and found myself while I was in the Youth Authority, I organized, and I've written on this, published several articles on the church inside of the prison. You have a religion operative on the inside of carceral spaces, and actually just got a grant from the American Academy of Religion to spin off an article that I just published on evangelicalism's eugenic logic and mass incarceration. But, this kind of began a serious during my carceral experience, similar to maybe what you see with a lot of figures, really literary figures. Malcolm X, does time and kind of really comes to grips with the significance, in his case, of Islam. And so I began to think seriously about theology while I was locked up. And then when I was paroled, studied theology at a small liberal arts college and wanted to study further. But, theology, the last, you'll like this, Damien, the last theology class taught in California's institutions of public higher education. I mean, you're San Jose State, one of the earliest state, but it was at the College of California in 1871. It was a natural theology course. And I've talked to John Douglas about this. Can we get any of I don't know if you can get any details. I maybe have to look around in the Bancroft and see if there's anything that I can find. But I wanted to study theology, and one of the few places that theology is flourishing is in the UK, in St. Andrews, where I took my degree. Connecting, communities of faith with the tradition, as well as with contemporary cultural questions, right? So really flourishing, and it's so wild that I was privileged to take a postdoc at Cambridge, and I lived at Ridley Hall. And this actually connects back to Kevin, because the first time I contacted him, I think it didn't see or ignored several emails that I had sent. We were hoping he would come speak to us at Berkeley.
That sounds familiar. I tried getting in touch with him by email a few times to no avail.
Well, and this is a good thing to know, because he and Sheila are the same, and they were often on sort of responded to emails together, and so and really had a tight commitment to Kevin's writing, and so often the invitations, just probably getting 1,000 emails and invites, but you get him on the phone, and you got him, and I got him on the phone, and I would stay up because we're 8 hours ahead in England, right? In Cambridge, where I was doing my postdoc, and I called him to try and get him at this event we had a small grant for, and he picks up the phone, Kevin Starr here, and I'm sort of about to fall off my seat. The guy just picked up the phone. Said, "Look, you don't know me, but I'm from Tracy." So I tried to give him my credentials as a bona fide Californian, because I knew he believed in that. That is something, like our connectivity to one another matters, and all our diversity and complexity, but our stories matter. I said, "Look, here's who I am." And I said, but I'm at Ridley Hall, Cambridge. Right. And the first thing he says right off the top of his head, he says, "Ridley, the bishop?" Which is to say that Kevin not only values I'm from Tracy and sits on the phone with me for 45 minutes from his office in USC. And then he tells me, "Call me at home when I got to go do some fundraising thing. But call me at home." And he gives me his home phone number. And I'm thinking, I'm shocked again. But also the fact that he knew Ridley was a 16th century Anglican bishop of London, who was killed, was trained in Cambridge and killed as, part of one of these Reformation figures in Oxford. The fact that Kevin didn't just say, well, this vague Anglican figure, but knew that he was a bishop, and that the sort of ecclesial particularities mattered to him, also blew my mind. but I realized, this is somebody I can talk to who not only understands California, but understands theological history, as well as contemporary questions that would integrate the theological. And that's really, in a lot of ways, a catalyst for our effort to come into his work with these theological lenses, not only to see that he's telling some features of California's religious history, but for his own vision, he's employing theological categories as when he need, selectively, but in an ad hoc manner with his own theology at play. But it's there, and so we wanted to pick that up for inquiry.
Wow. So let's back up. Let's zoom out a little bit on Kevin. So, and his place as a historian of California. So he's known for, well, actually, why don't you tell us what he's known for? He's known for a massive multi-volume work. Can you describe that a little bit?
Well, I think I could pull it down from the shelf, but it would it would. I don't know if I have enough arms. I can try to do that. He's known for, of course, as you know, Damien. I'll see if I can do this. Okay. He's known for. This is the California section. Sorry, and it's.
I love it.
But he's. So those are the 8 volumes. Right. So starting with Americans of the California Dream. That was a Harvard dissertation. Which is, if any book can come under the most critique of Kevin, it's that one. he said, and I think he would probably be critical too. And yet it did launch the series 50 years ago last year, all the way up to Coast of Dreams, right, which kind of gets you into Arnold Schwarzenegger after the recall. But then the final one, Material Dreams, Endangered Dreams Through the Depression, The Dream Endures, World War II. Then you have the sort of Malcolm Harris doesn't like the term, the post-war, because we've constantly been in war. But the Many of the Dreams, looking at sort of ingenuity and just in the actually through the progressive era, and then this is the post-war, so the one he grew up in, Golden Dreams, which was the last one that he had written, and so he's got those volumes. He's got hope you don't mind me doing this, the single volume, which is my most dog-eared volume of his. And then he's got this. He said that everyone, probably you should do this too, Damien. Everyone should write a failed novel. So he's got this. This is the second book he wrote, which the chair Anne from the California from the Book Club of California said this is the first book she bought when she moved to California. And so Kevin's failed novel lands end about a librarian. And have you read this one?
No, I want to read it. I didn't know about it until I read your book. So
it's wild, and he tells a story about a sort of contemporary '80s librarian of San Francisco who's kind of connecting in his consciousness with a family member, but earlier San Franciscan sort of protagonist of the lead protagonist in the novel. It's this back and forth kind of reflection that is. In some ways, Kevin has said, the closest thing he's got to an alter ego, the figure that he describes. And then, of course, his final two volumes, he really gets into, these are published by St. Ignatius Press. So all the other ones, the majority, published by Oxford, with the exception of Coast of Dreams, up to Schwarzenegger and telling the 90s story. But then he comes around to sort of reckon with the history of Roman Catholicism in North America, right? And it was Bob Sankiewicz and I think Rosemary Beebe at Santa Clara who I think, along with Sheila, helped to finish the final volume, although the manuscript was done. I think it needed some footnoting and some things checked. But to get these final two volumes, which I think I'd heard, and I think we mentioned in the book with specificity, I have to double check, but I thought this was supposed to be a 4-volume reckoning with Roman Catholicism in North America. And the reckoning was both to give his own critical account, as well as a hopeful one. I mean, as a Roman Catholic, he was totally rattled and horrified by the scandals in the Catholic Church. And yet, as a Catholic who did not experience and Mike Davis talks about this in his final chapter, that Mike's mother told Mike's father to do not ever let him near a priest. And, so Kevin knew about it, but was not part of his experiences. So I think this was his effort to go back. And I think Kevin and I talked about mass incarceration and some of my work there. And I'm not sure if he was, he might have been convinced in a longer conversation about abolitionism, prison abolition in particular. But he did say that, those offending priests should have been thrown in prison a long time ago. Which I think is a little bit toward a kind of a particular vision that moves away from mass incarceration if communities can kind of handle harm done within their own contexts. So that was his final reckoning, and I don't think he's so much known for his treatment of Catholicism because he was just starting it at the end. But he's really known for his single author account of California. And he didn't do everything. It's almost like he did know everything, but I mean, who can do everything? But he gave us a hell of a lot.
So that concludes part 1 of my conversation with Jason. Stay tuned for part 2, which is coming soon, when we delve deeper into Kevin's work and his unique redemptive view of California history. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.
That concludes